Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club. Brett here. One of the things that we're thankful for here on the podcast is that we have an engaged listenership through Discord. We're lucky to be able to showcase some of their own interviews and projects. These include their interview podcast, Discord Game Club Just Rhetoric, because it always has to have a JR at the end, and Defeating Games for Charity, a streaming event that will return this January. The podcast interviews in particular give us a break when we need one. This week, BioStats and Calamity Nolan bring together both of those with an interview with Phil Salvador, who is not a Discord member, but instead the library director of the Video Game History Foundation, which, incidentally, is the beneficiary of the Discord's charitable work. It's a fun listen, and if that sounds like your thing, enjoy. If not, we'll be back in your ears next week. Happy Thanksgiving to our listeners celebrating in the U.S. We, of course, are especially thankful to Bio and Calamity for their help this week. Take care.
Welcome to DGC Just Rhetoric, a podcast where Nolan and myself interview content creators. Today we're excited to have Phil Salvador, the library director from the Video Game History Foundation. I'm your host Ryan, or BioStats on Discord, and I will let them introduce themselves right now.
Hello everybody, I'm Nolan, or Calamity Nolan on the Discord.
And hey, I'm Phil Salvador, like Ryan said, the library director at the Video Game History Foundation. I've been working here for about 3 years now, helping catalog and preserve our video game history materials.
Most of the people who will be listening are at least vaguely familiar with your foundation, but can you give a brief description on your mission and sort of your goals?
Absolutely. In sort of more casual settings like this, I like to joke that our goal is to make video game history better, which is a very broad phrase, but, video game history is a very broad field, and I think people, when you look at an organization like ours, it's like, okay, well, how are you going to improve game history? How are you going to preserve stuff? And that's such a broad mission. I think we kind of break down into three things. Part of it is advocacy and helping push for greater changes to make video game preservation and accessibility to game history easier. There is a celebration aspect to it, which is we do pop-up exhibits. We go to events like the Game Developers Conference and do talks and run booths about video game history. And then we also do preservation, which is not focused on the games themselves, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit, but we focus more on things that are going to be useful for studying video game history. And so that's been a big part of my job, has been our collections of things like game development materials, game magazines, stuff that you would need to use if you were trying to research this area.
But it looks like you've been there since 2022.
Yep, started in February 1st, so coming up very close in 3 years now.
On the website, looks like you're a team of 6. You have sort of a board of 4 and another 3 industry advisors. Can you just give us an overview of the structure and who's involved?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not going to say it's misleading, but there are 2 full-time staff at the foundation. It is me and Frank are the full-time employees who are there all the time, and we rely on our strong network of volunteers to help us. So some of the folks on the team page, we have like Travis Brown is our director of technology. He works in the game industry, but he also helps manage the tech for us and all the, making sure our archive systems are working and designing tools to help us do what we need. And he's been making some great stuff. Or Amanda, our engineer, is coincidentally Frank's wife, but she's been doing some great web development stuff for us. So we like to say we're a scrappy organization. When it comes to like making the podcast, Robin is our person who produces that. And she does that because she's interested in it. We have someone else on our sort of slowly growing content team who helps us edit videos because he's just very enthusiastic about that. So we're very reliant on a network of folks who want to help contribute to this, but primarily day to day it tends to be me and Frank, our day-to-day operations. Frank is sort of running the business side of things and helping bring collections in. I get the mountain of stuff and think, oh my god, how do we organize this? How do we actually make this accessible to people? Which, when you get like a magazine, a magazine is a magazine, but when you get like a CD with images from obsolete formats from the 90s that nobody has used outside of a magazine publisher in 30 years, we like to joke that those are fill problems. So my job is I deal with the fill problems at the foundation.
Can you talk a little bit more about what your role as the library director is, please?
Yeah, so I want to give a little backstory to this to explain maybe why I'm here at the foundation. So we were founded in, I think, formally in 2016, but really launched in 2017 by Frank Cifaldi, our founder. He is an ex-game journalist, ex-game developer who has always been interested in video game history and preserving it. He was involved in a site called Lost Levels many years ago that collected a lot of unreleased games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And it got to the point where he was doing this and building up this huge collection of materials, but it got to a point where it was like, when you talked with developers, they'd say, oh yeah, talk to Frank. And that wasn't really a formal enough thing to do. So he started a foundation. He decided I actually want to do this professionally. But he's been collecting a lot of this material for years. A lot of what we have is stuff that he had in his personal collection that's now part of the foundation. And it got to a point where, after you hit a certain, threshold or event horizon where, we have a library with shelves full of stuff, it was like, we need someone to actually work on this material. So that's what I do. I was hired as the librarian I like to say, turning, a collection of stuff into a resource people can use. So part of that is just structurally understanding things like, do we know the dates on all these magazines, these, games that are made, like not games that are made, game production material, like who made this, what company is it associated with? Do we know the time periods? How do we we have this giant thing of PDFs. How do we sort these and organize these together? So a lot of it is that just kind of structural, how are we managing things angle. But then a lot of it is also our big push we've been doing is we want this stuff to be as accessible as possible. And we've been we have been working towards a digitally accessible library portal that we're launching hopefully pretty soon, where we've been in the process of digitizing things and finding out how to, we get, again, like those unusual old materials, like, okay, how do we make this available in a way that matters to researchers? Somebody gives us a VHS tape. It's like, okay, not just how do we catalog this, not just how do we digitize this, but then what can we do to make this a better research tool? I'll give you a weird example that I love as kind of the challenges I face day to day. I don't know if either of you or any listeners remember the show Video Power from the 90s. It was a really cheesy video game show where like kids come on and compete against games, and there's the Johnny Arcade hosts it, and he's like the bad dude arcade man, and it's horrible, it's cheesy. Someone who was on that show donated all the paperwork he had from when he was on that show, along with a tape of the episode. And so the thought was like, okay, we can put all this up, but it was like, no, if we transcribe the episode, people can search for the names of games. So we figured out how to do like an interactive transcript alongside the video. And it's like, we don't want it to just be like a Google Drive where people just dump things. It's like, no, we want to be transformative. We want to make this into a tool people can use. So, in this video, I think the runner-up got a copy of the NES game Journey to Silius. And so if you search for Journey to Silius in our catalog, you get that episode of Video Power, but you also get the Electronic Gaming Monthly where they reviewed Journey to Silius and all those things. So we're trying to make, we have unique enough collections that a big part of my focus has been how do we make this into a powerful thing that if people want to understand video game history, it's not just stuff on a shelf.
Sounds like incredible work you're doing, and we're obviously big fans of it here.
Thank you.
But can you tell us in your words, why is video game preservation important?
Well, it's important for the same reason that any kind of media preservation is important. I've gotten this question a decent amount. I would say the best one was I spoke on BBC Radio about a year ago, and the host seemed very skeptical about whether our pursuit was worthwhile. But it's the same reason that you care about, preserving movies or music or art or literature. It's like, this is popular culture, and you can. Every time you hear the game industry talk about its importance, its games are bigger than movies. This is how many billions of dollars. Look, they referenced Mortal Kombat on The Simpsons or whatever. Like, you hear those things brought out all the time. And I think we're at a really interesting place where, film now, I think, is heavily recognized as this very important medium. Early on, it wasn't. Early on, film was just this kind of disposable thing. You would make a movie, you would send prints to a theater, and they get thrown out. A lot of early interest in film preservation came from enthusiasts who were just kind of saving copies of these things before they were thrown away or burned up. I think we have recognized video games as a culturally relevant art form earlier than other mediums. Like for film, a lot of that didn't really start until sort of like the new Hollywood era in the 60s and 70s. We've gotten this while the people who made like Space Invaders and Pong are still alive. So like we're at the point where we're able to actually intervene and help preserve this stuff and figure out some of these rights issues and all that early on. But if we want to understand ourselves and our culture, we need to be able to go back and look at our culture and understand how it was made and what it was reflecting on. And games are no different in that respect than any other medium that's treated as more of an art form than games are, versus games have been treated, I think, historically as toys. That's how they were marketed. But we are, as a society is a really broad phrase, but as a society, we are addressing that faster than I think has happened for other mediums.
Are there any misconceptions about the preservation of games that you can clear up for us?
One thing I like to joke about is, people talk about game preservation as this kind of monolithic thing. Like, we're going to preserve video games. And what does that mean? Is it just a game on a shelf? Is it, like YouTubers with their wall of video games behind them? Is that video game preservation? And something I like to not joke, but seriously say is, game preservation isn't one discipline. It's like 300 different disciplines, because everything has a different, extremely specific expertise you need to understand it. Our founder, for instance, Frank, is very interested in the Nintendo Entertainment System, as I mentioned. And there are cases where, when you're trying to like rip an NES game off a cartridge, it's like, okay, what type of chipset was used on this? Do we have the tools to analyze that? One time we got a Super Nintendo game in, like a prototype in, and it just wasn't working, and he was trying to figure out why. And it turns out that whoever had like put the chips on the board had like I think we got loose chips, and they were mislabeled in the wrong order, and so we had to just like know to flip things around. We got a prototype for an unfinished game for the original Xbox, and it is currently on an Xbox dev kit in our library. I am terrified to touch that thing because I don't know how to rip Xbox hard drives. Like, that's just not an expertise I have. But we know people who do know that. So when the time comes to preserve that, it's like everyone has a little piece of this picture. Even the cultural stuff, even, working with source code, being able to work with NES source code is maybe different from working with arcade source code. We had a case a while back where we had to recompile an NES game from the source, and we had to find like the weird compiler they were using in some like weird piracy database online. It's complicated, but like you can't just like give someone a game and say, hey, preserve this. It's like, there's a lot of different approaches depending on the format. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is it really bugs me when people say preserved in the past tense, because nothing is ever permanently preserved. I wish I could remember the librarian I heard this from. She had a very good quote about this, but it's the idea that preservation is not an activity that happens in the past tense. It is always ongoing. If you have an NES cartridge, it's like, that's not preserved because it's on a shelf. It's like, okay, who's making sure that still works? If you make a rip of that cartridge, okay, who's maintaining that file? How is that file going to be accessible in the long term? Are you are you making sure it works with emulators? What if, there's a time 30 years from now when like current NES emulators don't work on modern devices? There's all these components to it. And I think people want to be assured that something is complete and safe for all time. But no, it's, there's a strong human labor element to it, where like we need to keep making sure things work and keep making sure they're accessible in meaningful ways beyond just assuming, something is taken care of because it's on somebody's shelf.
I think also with video games, there's a lot more complexity than you might find in something like movies or books, because there's a lot of versions of video games, and increasingly so, right? With different ports and different patches and re-releases and remakes and remasters. So is there any particular way you approach preservation for that, or is it something that's still ongoing?
So I can tell you some caveats about what we do, but then also just kind of my thoughts on it in general. The caveat is that as the Video Game History Foundation, we don't actually focus on the games as much, only because there are other folks doing that right now. There are places like the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, Stanford University, the Library of Congress, honestly, University of Michigan. There's a lot of places that are building these collections, and we don't feel the need to replicate that. It's like, given a $10,000 budget, it's like, would we rather buy 10 complete in box N64 games, or would we rather go to a developer's house and digitize all their papers? Like, that's kind of the calculus for us. But also because we don't want to deal with the questions that you just brought up. Like, that's, given our time and energy, it's like we don't want to like have to practically do that. But thinking about it more broadly, I mean, I think it really depends on what the mission of the institution is. To kind of approach this from two angles. Every place that does video game work comes at it from a different perspective. Like Stanford University has the Silicon Valley archives, and they're doing video game preservation as part of that. So a lot of their interest is in the foundations of the tech industry and understanding how people interact with technology. Versus you have the Museum of Modern Art as a really unusual case where they've been collecting games, but they're not like collecting, hardware to run it on, like playing with the actual controller. They have like, if you go see their game exhibits, it's just like a game on a screen with a generic controller, and they're more interested in the artistry of the game and the design of the game rather than like the input devices or having an original cabinet. Versus you go somewhere like the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment in Oakland, and they are all about playable preservation, and they have the original hardware out for you, and it gets the hell beaten out of it because people are playing with it every day, but like they want you to actually have the experience of using the original controllers and the original TVs. So I think everyone comes at it from a different angle like that. But in terms of all the different versions, I think it also depends on what researchers need. When we were doing our the study we released last year that proving that 87% of video games are out of print, one of the questions that came up for us was, well, how do you count different versions? I gave the example of like I don't know, like Earthworm Jim, for instance. Like there's a Genesis and a PC and a Sega CD and a Super Nintendo version. There's probably a PlayStation version. There's like an HD remake, and like what do you count as being in release? And we purposely went very broad and just said like any version of the game that's the same thing. But if you're someone who's studying, like the palette limitations of video games, having the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo version, it's going to be a very different experience. If you're a museum that's collecting games around art, you might value both those versions. Versus if you're running like a video game Hall of Fame, you might not care as much about having both on display for people to research with. I think that's it feels like a cop-out to say that it's up for everyone who's preserving video games to decide, but it really is. I mean, if you're a collector and you feel like, Earthworm Jim isn't preserved unless you have every single edition of the game and you have like the Taco Bell toys that came out for it, then like, that's your perspective on the game, and that's, that's valuable and that's worth doing. But at the same time, I think, some institutions might prefer just to have one version of the game. Some versions might prioritize the toys that they're trying to capture, like us, the cultural ephemera around video games. Not that we have the Earthworm Jim toys. I had one as a kid. It's probably somewhere in my attic at home. But yeah, I think it varies based on what you're trying to collect around and who you expect your user is going.
Quickly define what you mean by cultural ephemera.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I use that a little broadly to encompass things like toys, but we like to say that we collect context is the very broad part to that. So it's focusing on the things that tell us about how games were played and understood. So we mentioned the example of Pokemon. Pokemon Red and Blue, obviously a huge deal. We don't have those physical games. What we do have is we have a copy of the Time magazine issue where Pokemania is the cover story, and there's an article about like Pokemon. Is it satanic? We ask these concerned parents. And yeah, I can see your face, Ryan. Exactly. Yeah, but like that is as much a part of the story of Pokemon as the game itself. Like there's only so much you can tell from having the game artifact. And going back to the Earthworm Jim example, like I didn't play the games growing up. I watched the cartoon and I went to Taco Bell and got the Jim on his pocket rocket wind up toy or whatever. And like that, understanding how games were intersecting with that larger pop culture industry and being recycled into toys in various ways tells you about how they were being perceived. I mentioned earlier that games were being seen as toys. And I think that's a great example where like Earthworm Jim, whatever its artistic merits, I think Earthworm Jim 2 is an incredible troll of a video game that actively hates the person playing it. I think it's very funny. But like, Earthworm Jim got turned into a cartoon that got turned into a Taco Bell tie-in for kids. And it's like, how many degrees removed, is it just IP? Is it just a toy people care about? Having those toys tells us more about that than just having a copy of the game. So we don't collect a lot of like physical artifacts like toys because we're focusing again on like getting things to people for research digitally. But that's the kind of stuff we try to prioritize. I have a very silly example. I'm kind of rambling about this, but this is something I love. Ubisoft recently shut down their offices in San Francisco, and so they called us and said, hey, if you want to take things, feel free to come here. And so it was a lot of like awards and stuff that was left behind, posters. We have like a fat head of Ezio from Assassin's Creed, just all these weird things. And the one that I love is they had an award. They were nominated for a Webby Award for, I think it was a burp sound effect they made for maybe a Rabbids game. But we have a giant framed plaque that says, you have been nominated for burp. And so that's just like, okay, that's a weird intersection of like game design and awards and the kind of frivolity that's involved in video games versus the seriousness of granting award. It's strange, but it's like, okay, that actually gives us a little insight into the culture around this stuff. So cultural ephemera, very broadly interpreted, thinking about just like the context around the making of games. That's what we think is the really valuable stuff.
When I first encountered the name of your foundation, my first thought was, oh, they're saving games. And then you get to the website and you realize it's the magazines, it's developer documents, design notes, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all the things that also go into marketing the game and building the game from the ground up. And it's sort of you do have sort of a push of, we're here for researchers in that classic library sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I think something we like to do is we don't want to lean into the video game-ness of that. I think there are a lot of places that still treat games as a novelty, and it's like, games are art, Space Invaders, Tetris. When we did our report that we did, one of the goals we had going in was like, I want this to be as boring as possible. I want like Times New Roman 50 pages of single space font, because it's like, no, this is a serious research field. I think there is, still concern among copyright holders about, the fact that games have been primarily just disposable entertainment objects. When they see places that are doing preservation or they see people collecting, I think there's often an assumption that it's just about entertainment and consumption again. There was a case a couple of years back where there was a petition to get more exemptions in copyright law for video games. That's always an ongoing process, but this was an institution that, their website said, like $25 to play all day. Come visit our museum and play video games. And the argument was made where it's like, this is not a place of research. This is not a place of scholarship. This is a place, of like kids' birthday parties or whatever. And like the Copyright Office kind of bought that argument. And it's frustrating because games are fun. You see the argument being raised over and over about like, oh, people just want to play games for entertainment. It's like, heaven forbid we want to examine the things that were made for fun, and we might have fun doing it, but we purposely do want to approach it from that sort of scholarly angle. I think a lot of folks in the game industry are nervous about that. I think when people say, well, when we go to people and say, hey, we want to preserve video games, they're like, are you a private collector? What's going on? So once we have our digital platform up, we hope that's going to make a strong case where we have internal materials that at one point may have been considered trade secrets, but now it's all part of that larger story of appreciating video games and understanding them, rather than just whirling through somebody's offices and IP catalogs like the Tasmanian Devil and coming up the other side having illicitly enjoyed that's not the point of what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about your digital archive and your online catalog.
Oh man, that's coming again, hopefully very soon, hopefully in the next few months. And I feel like I've said that every month for the last year, but for real this time, this is happening. We have a whiteboard in the office with a date on it. This is coming up pretty quickly. But the goal is, again, we think people want to research this material digitally. We know how people research video game history. We know that it's often inconvenient to go sit down somewhere and play a game at a library for 80 hours. So people do research digitally. People use places like the Internet Archive. And we sort of joke that we've come at this from the angle of being frustrated historians, where, I think we all rely on things like the Internet Archive or community sites like Retro Mags, which has been scanning a ton of video game magazines, or, things that just kind of fall off a truck sometimes. I don't want to ever talk up the positive, virtue of the big Nintendo hack from a few years ago, because that was a crime that was committed. But it was interesting to see, having access to that material, that people were able to better understand the development process on some of Nintendo's games. So we come at it from a perspective of like, well, if we, what do we want? What would we want to have access to? And so, it's having curated collections that are searchable in certain ways, that have certain tags on them. So, for instance, I mentioned the example earlier of searching for Journey to Silius. If you search for that in our catalog, you'd be able to see, okay, let's see what's in the development materials section. Let's see what's in magazines versus promo materials. And then you can sort by like different the companies they're associated with and what type of material it is. I think it's, I think about something my mom said years ago, which is that the internet is the greatest library in the world, but all the books are just kind of thrown in a pile. And so we like the idea of wanting to be a more definitive source for that. We're never going to have everything, but it's like, of the stuff we have, let's present it in a way that's going to be useful and meaningful for people. Part of that is getting things into modern formats, like I mentioned earlier, but part of it is also just understanding, what things are and how they piece together. I'll give you a fun example of this, and this is one of the ones I can't wait to show people because it's such a bizarre story. We got a bunch of papers from a longtime game producer in the Chicago area who, worked for publishers and just solicited projects. And one of them, we were going through his, papers from some company, and there were a bunch of weird projects where it was like, we have this, here's something about like a pinball game that was being pitched to them, and then here's some notes about this survival horror alien action game where you're on a spaceship and you're like consuming people and mutating. And as we started going through all of his notes, we realized they were the same game. It started out as a pinball game, and the pitch was like, hey, this is neat, but I like the idea of like rolling around and controlling that character. Maybe that's something we can do. Then you look through the revisions of the design docs, and it slowly turned into, what if you're like a weird creature and you're rolling around? And then, what if you can transform? And it gradually turned into like this action horror alien combat game before it was canceled. And previously, we had those just organized as like miscellaneous game pitches, development memos, but it was like, no, this was a project. And by cataloging it all, and you can see like, the names of the documents starting like, Ultimate Thrill Pinball Pitch, Pinball Revision, Alien, and you keep going until you get to the final document labeled like cancellation letter. It's like you can tell a story just through the names of the things we've cataloged, which I think is kind of incredible. So like that's the kind of thing I'd like. I think people who research game history, especially people who aren't like professionally affiliated with an institution or anything like that, I think are used to kind of rummaging around and piecing things together. But whenever we show people our system, which is just built on the same tools that like university libraries use, like we're using a platform called Archive Space, which I'm sure every university in the US uses. People lose their minds because of the level of like structure and organization we can present, because people are used to just files sitting around on the internet. It's like, no, that structure is itself valuable and useful for research. So that's where, especially the first 2 years I was working here, that's where a lot of my focus was just trying to figure out what that even looked like.
You hear that, game developers? Send all your documents to Phil.
We will, it'll become a Phil problem. We will sort through. I mean, honestly, it's fun. Like, one of the big projects we did recently that I'm super proud of is we've been working with the people who created the Myst series to digitize all of their videotapes from the making of the series, which is, it's the filming footage from Myst. It's like Rand Miller on the blue screen saying, my friend, welcome to Dunny. But it's all the behind the scenes stuff. And so like, we got a box of tapes. And so we look through one. It's like, what the heck is this? It's like, oh, that's their company picnic the year after Myst came out. It's like just random things like that, and trying to piece together a story where it's like, okay, what's this interview? What did it go with? Oh, this was part of a pitch they did to get funding for this new development. And as you start to build the structure out, you start to see like how these things were made and what their priorities were and when things happened on the timeline. And that's without even like, producing a paper about it or anything. That's just trying to get things in order and make sense of it. I'm wired in a certain way where I love doing that, and maybe that's why I'm a librarian, but that's the part of the job that really gets me, is figuring out those puzzles.
Games industry is infamously secretive, and will have projects that gets canceled without ever even being announced, right? There's years of work that's just kind of lost in a void. Have you bumped up against this? And do you see the attitude towards allowing access changing in the industry lately?
We have run into it, and I think there's two problems that go with that. Well, yeah, it is trade secrecy is one of them, but I think the other problem is there's disposability, where everything is a secret you can't talk about until it doesn't matter anymore, and then it gets thrown away forever. And both those things happen at once. I think what we've seen is we tend to have, so far, better luck's not the right word, better outcomes working with individuals rather than companies. I mentioned that developer earlier on. He worked from Chicago. He worked for all sorts of. He worked for like Konami, Mindscape, Atari, Midway, and he's been very open with his materials. I'm sure whatever entity owns many of those companies. I'm sure if we went to Konami and said, "Hey, can we have all your memos from 1991?" They would say, "Who the hell are you? What the hell are you doing?" So like that's we've have talked with companies before, but there are always these barriers, especially because for larger companies, it's hard to move the needle on things unless it's like a product you're putting out, right? Our friends at Digital Eclipse, who just recently released the Tetris Forever collection, they're working with the rights holders and they're able to get some of these things because it's going into a commercial product. It's harder to just show up and say, "Hey, do you have some stuff for us?" Because they have to figure out if they can get rid of it, not get rid of it, but provide access to it. That has to go for their legal team and all these questions. Versus with Mark Flitman, this guy from Chicago, he was like, "Yeah, sure, okay." Same with Cyan. I talked to Tony. Tony does their legal stuff, and it's like, all right, just talk to Tony and he'll figure it out. And that's much easier than going through whatever layers you have at large companies. That said, I do think we're slowly starting to see a shift, but I don't think it's going to be there's never going to be like a giant light switch on this. I think we're seeing a greater recognition of the issues around preservation in game companies, and I think we're starting to see companies starting to recognize it feels weird to talk about preservation as a brand investment, but I think when I talk about, people, it's hard to move the needle unless people see it as like a product or something that there's, money involved in. I think it is like, hey, like people care about our IPs, people care about our brands. There is a benefit from showing this stuff and building brand loyalty is maybe the angle that seems to work with developers. The one that comes to mind recently was, have you paid attention to what's been happening with the Master Chief collection, the Halo collection on Steam? This has been fascinating. They recently they have been working with like community modders where they're like, hey, we have all this development material. Let's make it accessible to people. Just last week for the was it 20th anniversary of Halo 2? Oh my God. They cleaned up and released the E3 demo of Halo 2 that blew everyone's minds back in like 2003 or 2002. I can't remember what year they did that, but that was a huge deal. It's never been available publicly, and now you can just download it and play it. And they were like, yeah, this is, we want people to look at this stuff. And 20 years seems to be like around the time people get comfortable doing this. But no, I think that's I'm heartened by seeing more of that. I think there's been a lot of efforts, and we've been part of this too, around trying to like change the law or require companies to do more with preservation. But I think I get really heartened seeing more companies investing in making stuff available voluntarily, because that means the norms are changing around this issue. It means that, as much as it would be nice to have, new laws and things around some of these topics we're talking about, I think it's inspiring to see companies starting to voluntarily recognize the benefit of it. And even if it's entirely a self-motivated, this gets people to care about our brand or whatever, like that's still a win. That's still part of preservation. That's still part of this larger ecosystem we're all part of.
I think we've sort of been hinting at this for a little bit about your, laws and rulings. Do you want to talk about the latest news from the Copyright Office?
Yeah, I don't want to, but yes, it's disappointing. But so for context, for the last 3 years, well, more broadly, every 3 years, the Copyright Office hears petitions to let people make new exemptions in a very specific part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to help with a lot of things, to help with like right to repair, with preservation. One of the big petitions this year was to allow McDonald's franchisees to jailbreak their McFlurry machines in order to fix them. And that petition got approved, which is great. That was my friend Meredith. She has given us, she has fixed the national McFlurry downtime problem. I'm so proud of her. But there's been a lot of efforts over the last decade to do this for video games too, specifically around copy protection, where even if you could legally do video game preservation work with a copy protected video game, breaking copy protection is still illegal no matter the circumstance. So there's been efforts to, get new exemptions in the law to make that possible. And we've gotten some over the years. This most recent one was a push to allow remote access to video games. So if there's I should say out of print video games. So, if a library has a rare video game that a researcher needs, they sign off, researcher sends a research request, it gets approved, and then they provide access in like secure in-browser emulation to that game. And this was being spearheaded by the Software Preservation Network and the Library Copyright Alliance. We provided factual support. We were providing support on the study we did, showing that games are out of print. I spoke at a hearing at the Copyright Office, and I told the game industry to their faces that they were wrong about how the game industry works. That was kind of fun. They were making very asinine arguments. Unfortunately, the exemption was not approved, and it's incredibly frustrating because it seems like I'm not speaking for Software Preservation Network or the Copyright Alliance or Harvard Cyber Law that did work on this, but it really does seem like the Copyright Register who made the decision didn't really meaningfully engage with a lot of the evidence. And I think there is still this persistent fear of like, well, people want to play video games, and this assumption that people want to pirate games for fun, and that's why people want to play things, and that you can't rule out that people want to play games for fun. There's no way to prove that. So like that's still an ongoing frustration. I mean, we're proud of the job we did. We think that all the work we did has moved the needle on this stuff. I just saw today that GOG announced they were doing a new internal program where they're starting to like mark games as being forward compatible and trying to like get approval on that. I don't want to take credit for that, but I also saw the splash that our study made, and that I think pretty fierce backlash from the public that the failure of the petition process went this year. I don't think we weren't part of that equation that did that. And again, maybe it's the same thing with game companies where it's like, this is a branding thing. This gets customer loyalty, but it still helps. It's still part of this bigger preservation problem. So even though we didn't get this exemption, I'm still hopeful and bullish about the future of this stuff. I still think we've made a pretty significant dent in the public perception around these issues. I will say that talking with video game companies, people are noticing, people are aware of this issue more and are starting to ask internally, how do we deal with this? I think that's the start of another conversation. We're purposely taking a break from this from a little bit just so we can focus on library stuff and not beat our heads against the wall. It's been a really, really tough month for people thinking about civic engagement and those kind of issues. We are recording this in early November, for the record. But I still feel hopeful about it because of the doors that this has opened. I mean, the one that kind of blows my mind is that various NPR shows, like when we put the study out, like we had 3 separate NPR shows contact us to want to talk about it. It's like we got game preservation in the news in a way that it really hadn't been before. That's not the end point. That wasn't the end goal. That's the start of this larger conversation we're going to keep fighting for.
And what's something that you sort of learned in that process of going with the petition to the Copyright Office?
Something I learned that was a little concerning, but I think really revealing, was during the hearing at one point, they had representatives from the video game industry there, and they said, hey, so this petition, compared to previous years, this has more restrictions in it and more approval. And they said, did this move the needle for you at all in terms of approving it? And their lawyer said no. And, they kept going back and forth, and they were like, what about this? What about this if they get approved? And they said something to the effect of, there will never be conditions under which we will approve this. And that made me realize that I don't want to be mean and say we're working with irrational people, but what we're working with is, the game industry hires lawyers to say, hey, go defend copyright. They go to hearings, and they're absolutists on copyright law, and they send back a report saying, hey, thanks for giving the ESA millions of dollars. Here's what we did this year. We defended copyright law. And it's like, okay, great. But talking with individual developers and people in the game industry, when we explain it, they say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's the Men in Black line about how, people are smart. A person is smart, but human beings are, was it dumb, panicky animals was the line for Men in Black. But it's the kind of thing where it's like, if your job is to defend copyright law at absolutely every cost, like, yeah, you are going to be kind of an irrational argument in this conversation. And I think, the future of this kind of work, I think, has to involve affirmative support from the video game industry. I think that, it's frustrating to go to a hearing and say, here we have this evidence showing these games are out of print. They're never coming back. The industry is not doing enough. We need these changes. And the counter argument is, No, we don't. Like, it's, that's never going to change. You're never going to like change their mind in a hearing because that's what they've been hired to do. Um, so I think something to take away from the future is just the idea that no, it's never going to be a case of like, you've convinced us, we see the error in our ways. It's working from the ground up. We have to talk with individual companies. We have to get people on board gradually and get them to be vocal about wanting to see this change rather than trying to force it from an outsider's perspective. I think has been something that's been important to take away.
I think there are sort of two topics: the study that you ran, and then the second sort of spinoff on this is, tell us a little bit about the Moby Games database.
So the study, just to fill in a little bit, because we've kind of hinted at this a lot, and some folks listening may have even seen this study, but we published a study last year proving that around 87% of games released in the US before 2010 are out of print. And we did that to provide ammunition for this copyright battle, but also just to put a number on something we've always known. Like when I go to a game convention and talk and I say, hey, who here has had to pirate a classic game to play it because there's no other way to get it? And every person in the room raises their hands. Like, we all kind of know this is happening. We've all heard the term abandonware. We've all talked about this anecdotally, but now we have a number we can put on it. And it's been kind of fun to see how people are reading whatever they want into that, or like some people are using it to say like, oh, I hate Nintendo. But we've also seen people who are using it to like justify grants for video game research or for expanding their museum. And that's really inspiring to me to know that like just the research we put out has made a dent in that direction. I think is really inspiring. In terms of those other things externally, I'll mention Moby Games we used for the study is pretty great. That is, I'd like to say it's sort of the IMDb of video games. There are a couple other competing databases. I think there's IGDB is the one that Twitch uses. But Moby Games, in my experience, tends to be better for a lot of the classic games, a lot of things for older platforms, a lot of really weird, obscure stuff, because it's almost entirely fan-driven. It's largely fan crowdsourced. It's currently owned by the Atari company right now. And I actually have a Moby Games mug on my desk. I supported them, got their 25th anniversary mug. But it's an invaluable resource, and the kind of thing that, like when the Internet Archive went down last month and everyone was kind of panicking, it's like, I don't know what we would do if Moby Games disappeared. And so it was great to, I like to think that a lot of what we do is building on what the community has done. So for our magazine library, rather than trying to rescan every issue of GamePro, we got permission from RetroMags, which I mentioned earlier, to use their scans and make them text searchable and all that good stuff. Same thing with this. Moby Games has been this invaluable community resource, and I talk to them, and it's like, it matters having scholarly research published that uses Moby Games as the primary data set. It really legitimizes the work the community is doing in a way that I want to encourage. I think is great. The GOG stuff I literally just saw before I started this podcast, so I don't know specifically what, but it sounds like it is just putting a label on like, yes, this game is forward compatible. Because a lot of like Windows XP games don't quite work today, so it's finding wrappers to put them in, all that. But it's having, again, spoken with a lot of folks in and around the game industry who do re-releases of these video games, they all kind of agree. It's like, yeah, the study kind of hit the nail on the head. In addition to proving the 87% number in our study, a big part of it was also exploring why games are out of print and things like those outstanding technical issues or the rights issues preventing games from staying up longer term. And I can mention this one publicly because they actually provided a letter of support for us for the petition, but AntStream Arcade, which is a cloud streaming game service for retro games, they were like, yeah, everything you said is correct. It's like, we run into these tech issues. It's difficult to get games for certain platforms out. They mentioned that, trying to license games from big AAA companies can cost $100,000 up front just to do the legal work to make sure they actually own the rights to the game, because they're not sure anymore because all the paperwork is gone. Like, yeah, it's been vindicating to hear companies saying like, yeah, this makes sense, you got this. And so, again, seeing companies like GOG investing more in like, we're making sure things are forward compatible. Xbox as well, they have a preservation team, and it sounds like a lot of that is, how do we make sure our code can deploy on future platforms? That's all part of this puzzle. I think I've said that a couple times so far, but it gives me a lot of hope to know that, we've moved beyond people just saying games are disappearing, pirate your games. Like, I think that was the conversation 10 years ago. I think we're past that now. I think we've gotten beyond that. We've gotten to, what can we do materially to make sure this doesn't happen again? And so we see things like games voluntarily releasing server code, or companies making sure their games are in a way, on a platform or in some kind of system that can be emulated or redeployed on future systems. That's more of like a hardware side thing. But if we have played a role in moving those conversations forward and getting people thinking about that, like, I'm proud of that. If that's something we've contributed to with this study.
So I actually found the article very interesting from an academic perspective.
Oh, awesome.
To give a really broad overview, what you did is you took a random sample of games that were in the Moby database across their whole, essentially, catalog timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got volunteers to try and track down if that game was playable or accessible, right?
Yes.
And then you recorded that in essentially a data set. And then the final number ended up being from, all these games, 87% couldn't be played. Now, that's masking a little bit because you did a little bit more because you had, different content areas. Like, you focused in on one specific system.
Yeah.
There were sort of 4 parts to that. But I thought it was really interesting that you got the community involvement, and yet this is an academic paper, which is then causing to get popular press to make an impression in a field that's run by big business.
Yeah, it's to go on a tangent a little bit. It sounded like you had more to say about that, but just to interject with this is something I published an article about some years ago. There was a game I've been fascinated by. It's a homemade Myst style game from Hong Kong. It's called Comer, which is a really unfortunate name, but it's a Myst style game that was made by one guy who had there's a pacifist who hated violence, and he was so emotionally moved by Myst he wanted to make this game, and it is borderline incomprehensible. It's incredibly heartfelt, but it's very complicated, and he just sold copies out of his home for years. I have a copy, and the only evidence this game exists is Moby Games, a fan who wrote about it. There's very little information about this game. And so that was a case where I wrote an article about how do we try to account for this kind of community work in more academic settings. I think there's often an obsession with wanting to make the definitive database of games or the definitive canon of games in some kind of official context, but it's the Library of Congress will never be able to account for the Comers of the world. How do you do that if it's just this weird thing only fans care about, and finding ways to institutionalize the work the community does? So I was really happy with that in particular, to be able to make Moby Games part of this, and the work the community has done part of this larger conversation that now affects large multi-billion-dollar businesses.
For people who are listening, the fact that you were able to fan source some of the volunteer labor for that, please go give your support if you're able to.
We had volunteers in our Discord who are our supporters, and I felt bad where it's people who are giving us money, but we're also making them do work. But they were very enthusiastic about it. But we also had some library science students from the University of Washington. They have a very strong, specifically video game focused information school up there. So they also did that as part of the research.
Yeah, I'll just insert here that next time you do it, I have one slight modification I would do. And I know you worked with somebody from Penn State.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't want to step on anybody's toes.
Let's hear it.
But what I would have done is, instead of a true random sample from the whole timeline, I would have stratified it by year.
Okay.
So 10% of the games that make it in your sample are from 1991. That's because 10% of the games in the database come from 1991.
Right. Okay. To make sure the distribution actually matches. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to make it a little bit more generalizable. But again, this is nitpicking around the edges.
No. Yeah. And that's what I thought about too, is the results we got were pretty surprising in some places. But I mean, it's there is a clear curve over the years where things getting into the late 80s, early 90s are more accessible. There's a big drop when you enter the N64, Windows 95 era. You can see those changes. But yeah, there were some things we found, it was I think less than 3% of pre-1980 video games, or I think pre-1985, I want to say, were in print. And that was one where I realized it was yeah, that's a good thing from a good outcome from our study. But as I looked at it, it was I don't really know what the margin of error is on this, because we haven't looked at what the population of just years is. But yeah, I think there's absolutely room to dig into that more. I think the year thing was something we hit on a little bit later into the study when we realized that could be useful. But I think it would be useful. I don't know. I'm not committing ourselves to doing this right now on the air. Maybe someone else can. But This copyright cycle thing happens every 3 years. It could be useful to do this again and being like, all right, listen, you said there's a healthy market for game re-releases. Let's see if this number has moved. And maybe it's going to be, 86% instead of 87% this year. It's like, oh my God, what a huge change. 1% in 1 year. But that is something I had not considered in terms of getting the distribution a little more close to matching the total population. But that's interesting. Yeah.
I'm hearing Ryan nerd out about this. BioStats is not just a handle on Discord. But maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit more about your background with gaming and, how did you get into this games preservation? What's your relationship to games?
Yeah, I on the one hand have a story I think everyone's heard before where it's like, oh, I loved games growing up and I thought they were great, but I had kind of a weird angle to it that I think forced me on the preservation path earlier. I was someone who was very much into computer games as a kid. I was not as much playing like Mario. My brother was kind of hogging the Nintendo. I was playing, again, all the weird Myst clones, all the weird strategy games, DOS shareware stuff. I thought it was fascinating. Loved it, had a good time, and then didn't think about it again for a long time. High school comes around, getting nostalgic, going to college, and the more I thought about it, I realized, hey, it's weird that you can't get these things anymore. I was not, there was not a huge collecting market. It was like, how do you even run these games? You could pirate Super Nintendo games. You couldn't pirate a lot of like educational games because honestly, it was like, I think the people running piracy groups didn't think that was cool. Who wanted to go back and play Millie's Math House, right? Like there was not a lot of interest in that. But those are video games too. And so I started a blog called The Obscuratory when I was a freshman in college that was like, hey, let's look back at some of these weird old things and give them a shot. Still running that blog today. It's been inactive for the last couple of years as I've been focusing on all this library stuff, and that's just been taking a lot of my time and energy. But it's, I think I pretty quickly got on being like, hey, there's these weird old things no one talks about. What's the deal here? And as that started evolving, I got more into understanding the history of it, and then more into the, hey, how are these things being preserved? What's happening with the Internet Archive? And that just kind of got me down this horrible rabbit hole. I was also a political science student in college. That is not the route I ended up going down. I worked on Capitol Hill for half a year, and it was not for me. But I realized I liked the research. I liked the library aspect. I worked at my university's library and eventually went and got my library science master's degree. All this was kind of happening at the same time. I can pinpoint a very specific event that has loomed large in my life's story. Back in 2014-15, there's the new museum in New York has a sort of a sub museum called Rhizome that has been doing like digital art preservation. And they did a project it was specifically in response to Gamergate in 2024, where they found these old CD-ROM games for girls that were very rare, very hard to come by, and they did a digital preservation project around them, and they made them remotely digitally accessible, the thing we were fighting for this year for copyright, with permission from the rights holder. But I remember I went to that event and just listened to people talk about, how we curate video game history and how preservation works and emulation and these questions. I talked with their technical director about like how they were doing emulation, and it was super engaged. I went back home after this event, and the next week in library school, I was in a class about digital curation, and they talked about emulation and how that's used to help make materials accessible. And that was the moment where I thought, oh, these two interests are not mutually exclusive. Like my interest in being able to work with emulators and being able to emulate old games, libraries and archives do face these issues too. I just saw an example of that happening in a novel application. Maybe there's something here. And that was in 2015. That was kind of the start of me ending up doing this professionally. That was when I started giving talks about this subject and eventually kind of worming my way into the volunteer community for the Video Game History Foundation and getting involved with that. I ran video game history and preservation panels at an event in Maryland called MagFest, which is a magical, fun event that everyone should go to. But I ran a video game history panel track there for a while, and so those things just started coming together really quickly and aggressively in those couple years until eventually during the pandemic, around that time, that was when the Video Game History Foundation was, figuring out what was coming next for them. And that was when they hit that threshold of like, we need to start cataloging this stuff and making it accessible. Who do we know who's a professional librarian who has experience in the field of game history? It was like, well, Phil. And that just worked out very, very well. That was a case where it was like, I had this career in libraries. I wasn't really sure what direction I wanted to take with it. I had a strong hobbyist interest. And we like to say, people often ask for advice. It's look for where the gaps are. It's like try to find where there's interest and where people aren't doing a lot, where you can bring something that you are uniquely interested in. And I think that's what happened there. It was like, I'm passionate about this historical subject. I'm passionate about libraries and how they work. And yeah, there's room to do that. And I've managed to luck myself into one of the jobs where that actually happens.
You're not the first guy I know that has an MILS.
Weirdly, my degree, they gave it kind of the mouthful name at the school I went to. It is a Master's of Science in Library Information Science. So I have an UMSLIS is my full five-letter title for my. I only put that at the end of my emails if I'm like really serious and stern. Otherwise, it's otherwise I'm just Phil.
You mentioned a lot of your PC game growing up. Was that your primary hobby? Was it just for fun? Were your parents supportive?
Oh yeah, I loved computers, and and they were very supportive of that. My parents were early tech adopter people. Specifically, I can remember there's one game I want to mention, and then I actually want to take a tangent to talk about kind of the weirder, kind of upsetting side of my origins with this, because I think it's actually interesting for talking about this stuff. So the game that really kind of lit my fuse was called The Labyrinth of Time. It was a point-and-click adventure game from 1993. I have the Macintosh version as a kid. It's, as a game, it kind of is what it is. It's like it's a 3D maze, and you walk around, you pick up items. There's a lot of dead ends. You can get to start the game over, but artistically, it is unbelievable. The artist of that game, Bradley Schenk, has done a lot of 3D graphics work, but he just, made whatever the hell he wanted to. So it's like this Art Deco world with surreal elements and things that don't make any physical sense. And it was jaw-dropping as a kid to have this like undulating 3D surreal world you could navigate through. It's still beautiful and bizarre, and there's nothing else like it. I love it. But that's the game that really got me like, okay, this is a world I can get lost in. This is amazing. And games like that did it for me. But I think one thing that also, and this is getting to this other stuff, that really got me down this path was, we had the nice Macintosh and the CD-ROM drive at home. They also had that at school. At school, they had just purchased a bunch of really nice computers with CDs, and they had all the software to support it, and we had the big fancy computer lab. We also had a not fancy computer lab with Apple IIs, and we used both of them. It was the computer lab and the old computer lab, as they called it, and that kind of started an early dialogue for me of like, okay, these games don't disappear when a new generation happens. They all kind of exist at the same time. I played, Super Nintendo games at the same time we had the PS2. Like, it was always part of the same thing. The thing that I think about a lot, though, with this is I didn't learn this until much later. I went to a segregated elementary school. According to the Department of Justice, our school system did not have the correct balance of, racial makeup of the schools reflecting what our actual city was. I went to the nice suburban elementary school where they had all the fancy new computers, and there were like 3 non-white students in the entire school. This didn't occur to me at the time. I didn't realize until later that when they redrew the boundary lines for my schools, it was a desegregation program mandated by the Department of Justice. And I think about that a lot, and I think about like, okay, obviously I have my nostalgia for this stuff. Like, okay, whose nostalgia is that? Who didn't get to have this nostalgia? And thinking about, other people's inroads to this stuff. A lot of our collections at the Foundation are, we have a lot of things from the NES era because that's what our founder, Frank, is primarily interested in. I've been collecting a lot of computer stuff, obviously, because, that's where my focus has been. But also thinking about like, okay, well, what isn't represented? Like who doesn't have that same inroad we do? And so part of it is finding ways to contextualize and explain things where even if you don't have a history with it, you can understand its significance, that you might not have grown up with the chance to play Millie's Math House or whatever, but understanding why that's part of, the shaping of the software industry. But also thinking about people who aren't me and what they might want to see. And part of it even comes down to like age and stuff. We focus a lot on like the earlier history of the game industry and things in the 80s. I've recently started buying a lot of like more recent stuff. Like almost every research question I've gotten has been about like Persona or various JRPGs. So it's like, okay, let's buy like Square Enix's press kits from E3. Like, let's focus on more recent ones. Like, so trying to, or we have our bookshelf section where we have a couple things like on display. We'll have like some historical books. I have, not that people come to our library that often, but I've chosen to display our Club Penguin strategy guide. It's like, no, this game is very significant to someone who isn't me. So I think, learning about, kind of that weird undercurrent to what helped shape my interest in computer games, I think I try to carry that only in the sense of like, I need to think about people who aren't me and may not have the same experiences matching me when I do this. Nostalgia is non-transferable. And I think if you're just making an alter to your own childhood, that's inherently exclusionary. And just what does a different version of that look like? And it could just be even, again, something as subtle as reframing how things are presented, but that's always in the back of my mind doing this work.
To say, we talked about the obscuratory. I think it's time, now that you just mentioned Square,
oh man,
to talk about your other sideline. But I do want to preface this, that one of the people we've had on this podcast previously, Ben, who has a podcast called The Dragoon Effect, is a staunch proponent of this stance that you're about to take. And I'm just going to read this little blurb.
Okay.
Final Fantasy VIII is weird, borderline experimental. It leans into surrealism and hallucinatory Roger Dean-like imagery rather than stately fantasy grandeur. It's overflowing with sincerity and emotion at a moment in time when the primary audience for games like this were teenage boys who thought feelings were hurt. Even though reviews of this game were glowing at the time, it has suffered greatly in reputation over the years, often feeling like the lost child of the PS1 era Square catalog. This website is a space to scream an alternate perspective into existence. And that website is FF8 is the .best.
Well, the full name of the website is Final Fantasy VIII is the best, and if you don't agree, I will destroy you. I assume there's no video for this, but I just recently printed up additional business cards to hand out if people ask me about this, because it's going to happen. But no, I like Final Fantasy VIII a lot, and it frustrates me that people don't. Two things I'll say about that to be productive about it. One is I also want to mention my co-author on the site, Ann Lady McDivitt, who's also a video game scholar. She's at Stanford right now, who's published a book about the early history of the game industry, who also feels strongly about this. We recently did a panel out here in California where she had a full selfie cosplay and screaming at the audience about how they're idiots. It was great. It was wonderful. But I think what's fun is, part of it is a crazy game and I enjoy talking about it. And part of it is there is a deep personal connection where it's a game about personal growth and emotions in a way that I think resonates better as an adult than as a kid. But I think it is also, going back to the history stuff and my career, I think it is also a really interesting example of, looking back at primary source materials and understanding this stuff. I went back to, and this is for the panel we just recently did. I think there's also articles about this on the site about going back to reviews at the time and comparing, how glowing it was when it came back out and how people were like, is it better or worse than 7? I don't know. But then it's not just that people forgot about the game and moved on, which happens, but there was a shift to strongly disliking it. And if you look at reviews on game FAQs and when they were posted or on other RPG fan sites, you can see a hard shift when YouTube happens and videos start going up and people just screaming at it and making fun of it and making sexist jokes at it and all that. And that's when you get that man-child screaming YouTube era, that's when the negative opinion really starts to coalesce around the game. And so I think about it in the context of we mentioned in the panel, this is a thing I love mentioning, is E.T. for the Atari 2600 now is considered, it's the worst video game ever made. It destroyed the video game industry. It didn't get bad reviews at the time. It got okay reviews. People were fine with it. I know people who enjoyed it. I've seen videos, if you know Electric Playground, the old video game show, they did a segment about a classic game expo, and they talked about E.T. and not in like mocking negative terms. It was just like, oh yeah, here's the guy who made the E.T. game. What happened was one of the first video game history books came out in 2001, and a lot of their interviews were with Atari executives, and their story was, oh, it was a terrible game, oh, what a disaster, it destroyed the company. It's like, well, no, what happened was their company was already, Atari was in bad straits. They overinvested in this game and produced too many copies, and it's easier to blame the failure of the game than it is for the executives to blame management failure. So that's the story that got told, and that's what gets echoed and repeated everywhere. And now the conventional wisdom is, E.T. is the worst game ever. It's like, no, it was. What did it? I think the book said it was, it was infamous for like its bad plot and gameplay. It's like no one was talking about the plot of E.T. Like that was no one cared about that part of the game. So I think, as I look back on this stuff, I think a lot about how the historical narrative is shaped. And going through all these magazines, you see how one specific perspective helps shape what people thought about something. There was a very famous issue of Next Generation magazine. I forget what it was called, but the cover was a picture of Mario from Mario 64, like shattered like glass. And the cover was like, why are there no good N64 games? What's going on? There's no games for this console. And that's the narrative that continues today. But looking back on it, it's like, oh, you said that because you were magazine reviewers receiving review copies of every single N64 game. And so there just weren't as many to you. Versus for kids, it was like, this like treasure trove of just an endless array of amazing Nintendo games. But to reviewers, it was like, where's all the good third-party stuff? Why don't they have Metal Gear Solid on here? And it's like, that's how the narrative got codified. And so I think a lot in my own work about how to break up that narrative, how to think about like, how do we shift the conversation around how people have been talking about certain games for decades. How do we reevaluate them and reappraise them and try to get them in new context? So part of that is through what I was mentioning earlier, like considering how to dismantle white supremacy in video game nostalgia. And part of it is yelling about how Final Fantasy VIII's great, you morons. Like, so they are both, for me, part of the same equation. Sometimes it just manifests in very different ways.
Prepping for this, not only did I read your academic paper, I read the article that you had on the Obscuratory.
Oh, yeah.
And then I read a bunch of your posts on this website that we're talking about now, the Final Fantasy VIII is the best. The article I read that I thought was the best was how you talked about Final Fantasy VIII is a love story.
Yeah.
And that's the story. But the compelling piece to me was how you tie this into sort of becoming an adult and realizing mental health awareness is important.
Yeah. I think I say this as someone who grew up in the Midwest in the Bush administration era. Like, it's very easy to be an edgelord. It's very easy to just be like cynical and just to shrug at things. And it's harder to open yourself up and be vulnerable. And I think, I can say a lot about like, oh, feelings are icky, but like, it's not even that as much as it is. It's just, it's, I think, an easier tendency to go for the harder edge, Shadow the Hedgehog, where's those damn Chaos Emeralds with his gun, than it is to invest in a story where like the literal events of the story matter less than the emotional through line to them. This is a really weird tangent, but I want to mention it just because this is where my brain is going right now. I just watched a fascinating movie called Riddle of Fire. I don't know if either of you've seen it. It just came out recently. It's a like children adventure movie where it's kind of, like The Goonies or Stand By Me. It's like 10-year-olds who are going out and have to go get their mom a pie, and they end up in this crazy adventure. But it's shot and presented like it's an 80s sword and sorcery fantasy epic with like a synth score, and there are some fantasy elements. There may be magic in the world. It's not clear. Sometimes characters speak in verse, but not all the time. But it just takes place in like the modern day real world. It's weird, and it's a case where it's like, I think as a kid I would have been like, oh, it doesn't make any sense. It's getting very obsessed with the literal truth of the story. versus like, no, it's about the emotion of like how epic and mythic being a child feels and having this whole world to explore. And it's the same thing with this, where it's like it's you know, it is a game that's ostensibly about like time travel and crazy shit happening and people get shot into space in a giant cannon. It's like that's what I liked as a kid. But then going back to it, it's like, oh no, that's all just kind of window dressing to getting to this deeper story that I don't think I appreciated until I was willing to go along with something that is more about the heart and the spirit than about the literal events. Like, I was very much a, you know, reading the wikis kind of person in high school and college, I think, going through all that. But I think as you get away from the literal interpretation and the, you know, comic book guy, I hope they got fired for that blunder, approach to stories, I think things like Final Fantasy VIII are richer for it. There was an article I wrote for the Obscuratory some years back about a really interesting game called The Legend of Lotus Spring, which was an adventure game that is set in a reconstruction of the Imperial Gardens in China. And it is a mistype game that is a love story also, where you go through rooms and when you see objects, you can interact with them and learn about what they were historically, but then it also shows vignettes of like your lost love that you remember walking through the gardens. And that game got horrible reviews at the time. Like IGN gave it like a 2 and was like, oh, this game's so full of estrogen. It's like Kathy Lee. It was just like really weird, like women hating. But if you go back to the Internet Archive's capture of that, on the side, there is a button to visit the IGN for Men section where it was just like, you know, babes in swimsuits. And it's like, oh, that's just kind of what was in the air at the time. And I think, you know, it's difficult to open yourself to like, okay, this is a game about feelings. It's not a game about kick-ass action missiles and combos. It's like, that's harder to approach, I think, especially as a young man growing up semi-alienated in the Midwest, you know. So I think that's part of the reappreciation of Final Fantasy VIII for me
One thing I want to add is every guest we've had on, we've asked about mental health, and can you tell us about some support systems you have in your life, or you know, your interaction with that?
You know, I'll mention something that's been, I think, difficult just as someone who works. That's a weird way. Someone who works? What the hell am I trying to say? For this job, I moved from Maryland and the DC area, which is where I lived for about 14 years, to the West Coast and basically started over. And honestly, California hasn't really been my place. I think I'm just more comfortable on the East Coast in cities and all that. But it's also been hard leaving everyone behind. You know, I went from having this very strong friend network to kind of starting over from scratch. And, you know, I've tried going to, you know, events and stuff out here. There's only so many Bay Area tech bros I can hear yell at me about AI before I stop trying. That happens a lot. It's really annoying, but, or blockchain or whatever. But, you know, I was talking to my friend Jackie, who was one of my good friends at the East Coast, and she mentioned having the bubble. And it's like, you need your people who you can support, you can turn back to. And I think coming out here, I tried to be strong. I was, you know, I turned myself into the work. I had the study, I had all my projects, I had a book I've been working on and off on about the history of Maxis, the creators of SimCity and The Sims. And I really turned into that to kind of fill the void out here. And it didn't work after a while. And it was difficult for me to go to the bubble and say like, hey, I need some help. I need some support. Like I'm having trouble here. But doing that helped. I'm on a much better track now than I was before. I was able to actually say like, hey, I got to talk about this stuff. And I think about it a lot because materially not a lot has changed out here. You know, it still feel kind of alienated from my surroundings, still trying to find my footing out here. But knowing where my support networks are and who I can rely on, people who are, you know, I never want to be a drain on people. I don't want to be an emotional vampire. You know, like there's always those concerns going through my head, anxiety. But like knowing the people who I can talk to and rely on about this stuff is huge. That's a huge deal. And, you know, obviously I took the step and went back into therapy, and boy, Zoloft is great. I was able to get back on that. You know, I was able to like readopt some of those things. But just knowing who is there that I can rely on to talk about this stuff without needing to feel guilty about it is something that was a real challenge for me. And I encourage people to do, because you know, there's so many platitudes about like, you're not alone, people are there for you. And that sounds like nothing at a point. So here's the like, person who is anxiety stricken in deep depression angle, which is there are people who won't be annoyed if you want to talk about this stuff. Trust me, they will actually be okay with it. That's the
Not only that, they sacrificed 4 to 6 years of their life studying it.
Yeah, well, I don't even mean therapists. I just mean like people within your own network too, who are like, they are willing to listen and be supportive to you, not just in a platitude, oh, we love you, but in a like, no, tell me all the shit you're going through. I'll say, wow, that sucks. Like it's good to have a friend like that to get you on track to where you can start addressing things.
Can you tell us about a non-gaming hobby you have?
I love birds. I love birding. Oh my God, they're fantastic. I was someone who grew up on, oh, you're laughing, but birds are, here's the thing is, they're everywhere. And if you don't pay attention, it's just like, yeah, there's birds. But as soon as you pay attention, you just start noticing all this everywhere. The other day, I watched a pigeon cross the street at a crosswalk. It was amazing. It was just such a polite little bird. But there are just so many little variations, and they have their own little dramas and stories, and you don't notice it unless you're paying attention to it. So as someone who's, I've started getting more invested in being able to ID birds by sight or by sound. Every time I go on hikes, I'm the guy who has to pause and say, like, wait, I heard a rustle. What's that? And have to stare at it for a while. They add so much color and kinetic energy, and it's wonderful. Back when I lived in DC, I had a balcony, and I befriended a family of crows, who they brought their little babies over, and it was just great seeing me hang out and eat seed. They didn't bring me anything shiny, but I also befriended a bunch of pigeons, and they brought me a piece of a brick. And it was like, okay, well, you tried, little pigeons. And a pack of cigarettes. That was weird. I don't really know where that came from, but no, it's fun to ID them. They're everywhere you look. Whenever you travel, you can see different birds you usually don't see before. Birding is fantastic, and it changes your relationship with the space that you go through every day. I'm someone, I don't have a car. Being in the Bay Area is a little hard with that, but I walk a lot. I walk to the train station. I walk to work. And, just being able to walk down the street and hear this little, like, it's like, oh, it's a scrub jay. And I can, like, look and see, okay, there's the little family. It just adds energy and appreciation to things where you are. I think my overriding, like, trait as a person is I try to be curious about things. I try to, like, even if it's not for me, like, understand why people like it. I have friends who are really into opera. I was like, you know what? I'll watch an opera. Sure. I just kind of want to get it from your perspective. And birds are just a constant curiosity whenever you're out in the world. They always just add a little something, and you're never quite sure what's going to come through.
To be clear, the reason I laughed there was because it was a change in direction, and you just immediately had it. You knew what it was.
Oh no, birds are the best. I mean, you can see behind me that I have the giant chicken there too. There was a game historian I'm friends with in Maryland who had outdoor chickens, and so we would frequently have things where we would go over and, like, play a prototype game and try to analyze it, and then go outside and feed the chickens, and it was great. It was just the ideal combination of activities for me as a human being.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to tell people about yourself, about the work you do?
Not really, no. I guess well, you have the fundraiser coming up, which I'm very grateful for, that y'all are raising money for the Video Game History Foundation. Besides shouting that out, I just wanted to mention that, I mean, as an organization, we are almost entirely small donor funded. We'll occasionally get some big checks, but we're able to keep going with our scrappy 2-person organization because of people's support. And, like, it feels, I don't want to, like, end on a, like, give us your money. Like, I never want to, like, be that crass about it, but it's the kind of thing where it's like, if this is an issue you care about, it's like, this is a smaller world than you think. We're good at doing sort of like the mountain lion response where, like, people think we're bigger than we are. I mean, I have, like, branded jacket. We have all our fancy website stuff, but it's like, no, we're a tiny organization, and I think we need more support than people might realize. So it's, every dollar helps is kind of my thought on that. And again, not begging for donations, but more just informationally, we're smaller than you think.
Well, you don't have to, because we were planning to end on give them money.
Oh, great.
As you mentioned, we do have a charity event coming up. So Ryan and I are some of the people who help run the Defeating Games for Charity event on Twitch. Our next one is coming up on January 25th and 26th of 2025. So really looking forward to that. We have a bunch of great streamers playing a bunch of great games, and we're raising money for the Video Game History Foundation because we think that they do great work. Last year you stopped by for a little bit. That was great.
Unfortunately, I'll be out of town. I'll be at MagFest, which I mentioned earlier. I'll be out of town that weekend. But cross fingers, we're hoping the library may be open by the time the event happens, so we'll be able to help show off the library for y'all. We'll see if we can get to that, but we'll fingers crossed. At the very least, we'll be able to show you some cool stuff we have in the collection.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we're looking forward to having a better explanation of what the Video Game History Foundation is and what they do, so that we can get some more excitement and awareness and support for you all.
Oh, yeah. I think people like what we do in the abstract, but I think, once the library is open and accessible, I think that things will make a lot of sense in terms of what we do in terms of an organization.
And if you don't want to wait for that event, you can just give money to the Video Game History Foundation right now.
Wait for the event. We're not going to go out of business before January, so save your donations for their stream.
Phil, besides Final Fantasy VIII is the .best and the Obscuratory and the Video Game History Foundation, is there anything else you'd like to plug? Do you want to mention your Twitch or your Twitter?
Also do stream on Twitch a little bit. Again, a little slower the last couple of months as we've been at the finish line for the library, but I'm also on Twitch at Obscuratory on Twitch. I'll be participating in December, which is the all DOS streaming marathon that happens all through December. But otherwise, I'd say stay tuned to Game History's various socials and everything. The goal is that once we are up and have the library open, you'll be seeing a lot more of me. Hopefully, we'll be doing a series of videos about our collections. So I guess I'm accidentally becoming a video essayist. So stay tuned for more of that.
Video Game History Foundation also has a podcast that people should check out.
We're coming back soon. Maybe that's spoilers. We've been inactive for the last year while we've been kind of retooling as an organization, but we've been banking episodes, and stay tuned for that.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Yeah,
absolutely.
Nolan, go ahead, plug your stuff, man.
This was fantastic talking to you. If you want to hear more of me, you can find me on Twitch at Calamity Nolan. Or you can find my games at upatnight.games. Thanks for listening to this episode of Discord Game Club, Just Rhetoric. We want to thank Brett and Tim for making the Dev Game Club podcast and for giving us a slot in their release feed. We also want to thank Mark and Artemage for starting the Discord Game Club podcast. Go listen to those episodes if you haven't already. If you'd like to hear more interviews like these, let us know. You can find us in the Dev Game Club Discord, where Calamity Nolan and BioStats. Goodbye!